What if the history you learned was incomplete? What if some of the most powerful women who shaped Europe from the 5th to the 15th century were purposefully written out of the story? What if their strength, their cunning, and their sheer will were twisted into something monstrous, all to dim their light and bury their truth? Number 11, the warrior queen who became a scapegoat. In the chaotic landscape of 15th century England, a queen emerged not from quiet chambers or a life of gentle diplomacy, but from the very heart of the battlefield. Margaret of Anjou, wife to King Henry VI, plunged headfirst into the brutal dynastic conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. Her story is one of fierce loyalty and astounding resilience, yet it was deliberately warped by those who sought to discredit her and her cause. Margaret arrived in England in 1445, a French princess from the House of Valois Anjou. She was intelligent, proud, and politically astute from a young age. When her husband, Henry VI, began to suffer from debilitating mental illness, the English court descended into factionalism. The Duke of York, Richard Plantagenet, saw an opportunity to press his claim to the throne, challenging the Lancastrian dynasty that Margaret represented. This is where Margaret's transformation from royal consort to military commander truly began. The historical record from this period, particularly that penned by chroniclers sympathetic to the Yorkist cause, paints Margaret in the darkest possible hues. She is depicted as a ruthless, vengeful, and manipulative figure, often referred to as a she-wolf or the Frenchwoman. These descriptions were not just insults. They were a calculated campaign to strip her of her legitimacy as a leader and a woman. Queen was expected to be a peaceful, pious, and maternal figure, a background influence. Margaret shattered those expectations. She directly commanded armies, levied taxes, and made strategic decisions that shaped the conflict. For instance, after the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, where the Yorkists gained significant power, Margaret was not discouraged. She rallied her forces, traveling across England to secure support for her ailing husband and her young son, Edward, the Prince of Wales. She masterminded campaigns that led to major Lancastrian victories, such as the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, where Richard, Duke of York, was killed. Following this battle, an act that undoubtedly solidified her reputation as an unyielding enemy, she is said to have ordered the Duke of York's head to be placed on the gates of York with a paper crown. While this detail might be true, it was amplified and used to portray her as barbaric and vengeful, rather than a queen defending her son's birthright in a brutal age. Later chroniclers, often writing under Yorkist or Tudor rule, further distorted her image. They emphasized tales of her cruelty and her perceived lack of feminine compassion, presenting her as a virago who led her husband and kingdom to ruin. The Croyland Chronicle, for example, while a valuable source, often reflects the biases of its time, contributing to the narrative of Margaret as an unnatural woman. Her strategic prowess was rarely acknowledged as military genius. Instead, it was attributed to feminine ruthlessness or manipulation of others. Her determination to secure the throne for her son, a natural maternal instinct, was twisted into a destructive obsession. The deliberate erasure of her true capabilities extends to her diplomatic efforts as well. Margaret was instrumental in securing alliances with France and Scotland, leveraging her royal connections to gain vital military and financial aid for the Lancastrian cause. These were complex, high-stakes negotiations, demanding immense skill. Yet these achievements are often relegated to footnotes, overshadowed by narratives of her emotional outbursts or perceived failures. Her actions were always judged through a lens of gender bias, where a woman's ambition was seen as inherently dangerous. After the decisive Yorkist victory at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, where her son Edward was killed and the Lancastrian cause was crushed, Margaret was captured. She spent several years imprisoned before being ransomed by King Louis XI of France. Even in her exile, her story continued to be shaped by those who had defeated her. She became a symbol of a lost cause. her agency and fierce resistance diminished into a cautionary tale of a queen who overstepped her bounds. The narratives focused on her tragic end, not the decades of struggle and leadership that preceded it. The historical erasure of Margaret of Anjou's strategic brilliance and political acumen was a deliberate act of propaganda. By portraying her as a monster, Yorkist chroniclers not only justified their seizure of the throne, but also provided a convenient scapegoat for the prolonged and devastating conflict. The true legacy of Margaret of Anjou is not that of a she-wolf, but of a formidable queen who stood defiant against immense odds. A true warrior who fought for her family and her crown until the very last breath, only to have her legacy deliberately twisted and diminished by the victors. Number 10. The child queen whose loyalty was forgotten. Isabelle of Valois, Queen of England, lived a life dramatically shaped by the political ambitions of men. Even though she was just a child, born in 1389, she was married to King Richard II of England in 1396, when she was barely 7 years old. Her story is often overshadowed by the tumultuous reign of her husband and the dramatic usurpation that followed, leading to a deliberate erasure of her quiet strength and surprising political agency. From the moment she arrived in England, Isabelle was a pawn in a grand dynastic game. Her marriage was a key part of a peace treaty between England and France, intended to bring a lasting end to the 100 Years' War. Contemporaries often dismissed her as politically insignificant due to her tender age. Chroniclers from the period, while acknowledging her beauty and grace, rarely attributed any independent thought or action to her. They presented her as a malleable figure, a living treaty, rather than a person with a developing mind or will. This early dismissal set the tone for how her story would be told, or rather how it would be overlooked. However, despite her youth, Isabelle developed a deep and genuine affection for Richard II. He treated her with respect and kindness, fostering a bond that went beyond mere political alliance. When Richard II was deposed by Henry Bolingbroke in 1399, who would become King Henry IV, Isabelle found herself in a perilous position. She was a French princess, now the widow of a king overthrown by a usurper. Her family in France demanded her return, but Henry IV saw her as a valuable hostage and a potential political tool. What many historical accounts gloss over is Isabelle's remarkable defiance and loyalty during this time. Despite being a child and under immense pressure, she refused to marry Henry IV's son, the future Henry V, even when offered the crown of England. She steadfastly insisted on remaining loyal to her late husband's memory, asserting that she could not marry the son of the man who had wronged her first husband. This was not the expected behavior of a docile child queen. It was a powerful political statement, a quiet act of resistance against the new regime. Chroniclers of the new Lancastrian dynasty had little interest in highlighting Isabelle's strength or her unwavering loyalty to Richard II. Their narrative focused on legitimizing Henry IV's claim to the throne and portraying Richard II as an unfit ruler. Isabelle therefore became a character to be minimized or ignored. Her refusal to remarry into the Lancastrian family, an act of significant defiance for a young woman of her era, was often presented as youthful stubbornness rather than a principled stand. Her potential as a focal point for discontented Ricardian factions was quietly suppressed in the official records. Later historians, relying on these primary sources, often perpetuated this image of Isabelle as a passive figure. She is frequently mentioned only in relation to Richard II's reign, her life after his deposition largely fading from the historical narrative, except for the bare fact of her return to France, her brief but fierce opposition to Henry IV, her quiet refusal to legitimize the usurpation, and her determination to honor her husband's memory are rarely given the prominence they deserve. She was not a queen who ruled or led armies, but her actions in the face of immense pressure reveal a profound strength of character that was systematically downplayed. After her return to France, Isabelle was married to Charles, Duke of Orleans, and tragically died in childbirth at the age of 21. Her short life, bookended by political marriages, left little room for her independent identity to flourish in the historical record. The French chroniclers, while more sympathetic to her as a French princess, still primarily viewed her through the lens of her dynastic connections. Her personal resolve, her quiet agency in rejecting Henry IV, and her unwavering loyalty were largely forgotten or deliberately obscured. Her legacy was reduced to that of a tragic footnote in the turbulent history of the English throne, rather than the story of a young queen who, despite her youth and circumstances, chose defiance over convenience. Number 9. The scandal-plagued queen silenced by slander. Joanna, the first Queen of Naples, ruled for nearly 4 decades in the volatile landscape of 14th century southern Italy. Her reign was marked by political intrigue, family betrayals, and accusations of murder that would follow her throughout her life and continue to overshadow her legacy for centuries. Her story is a stark example of how a queen's political acumen and power could be deliberately undermined by sensationalized personal scandals and the relentless smear campaigns of her enemies. Joanna ascended the throne in 1343 at the age of 16. Naples was a significant power in Europe, a wealthy kingdom coveted by many. From the outset, Joanna faced immense pressure, particularly from her cousin and husband Andrew of Hungary. Their marriage was fraught with tension as Andrew and his Hungarian kin sought to strip Joanna of her power and rule independently. This conflict culminated in 1345, when Andrew was found murdered, hanging from a balcony in Aversa. The blame immediately fell upon Joanna. The accusation of regicide, whether true or not, became the cornerstone of a deliberate smear campaign against her. Louis I of Hungary, Andrew's brother, invaded Naples seeking vengeance, portraying Joanna as a wicked, lustful, and murderous queen. Contemporary chronicles, often biased by their authors' allegiances, eagerly perpetuated these accusations. Nicholas of Jamzilla, a chronicler, depicted her as a woman of uncontrollable passions, implying she was responsible for her husband's death due to her alleged desire for another man. This narrative diverted attention from the complex political motives that surrounded Andrew's murder, such as the Neapolitan nobility's resistance to Hungarian influence and the intense power struggles within the Angevin court. Despite the accusations and excommunication by Pope Clement VI, Joanna skillfully defended herself. She fled to Avignon, the seat of the papacy at the time, and was put on trial before the Pope himself. During the trial, she successfully argued her innocence, though not definitively proving it, and managed to sell Avignon to the papacy in exchange for political support. This act of shrewd diplomacy, turning a potentially disastrous situation into a strategic advantage, is often downplayed in historical accounts, in favor of the persistent narrative of her alleged criminality. Her long reign, 1343 to 1382, saw her navigate a labyrinth of alliances and conflicts. She married 3 more times, each marriage a political maneuver to secure her position and protect her kingdom. She faced invasions, rebellions, and the devastating Black Death. Yet even in her later years, her political agency and accomplishments were frequently overlooked by chroniclers who preferred to focus on the sensational. Her patronage of the arts, her administrative reforms, and her efforts to maintain peace and stability in a turbulent region were overshadowed by the whispers of scandal. Her character was consistently attacked, her intelligence and resilience reduced to mere cunning or feminine manipulation. The image of Joanna as a femme fatale, or a Black Widow, was cultivated and maintained by her enemies, particularly by those who sought to usurp her throne. Charles of Durazzo, her cousin and eventual successor, heavily invested in this narrative. When he finally captured and imprisoned her in 1381, she was denied a fair trial and was ultimately smothered to death, an act that silenced her voice forever. Her execution was framed not as a political assassination, but as a just punishment for her alleged crimes, thereby solidifying the defamatory narratives against her. Historians for centuries, drawing on these biased sources, continued to emphasize the scandalous aspects of her life, rarely giving her the credit she deserved for her survival and rule in such a difficult period. Complexities of Neapolitan politics, the cutthroat nature of medieval power, struggles, and Joanna's remarkable ability to stay on the throne despite overwhelming odds were simplified into a tale of a morally corrupt queen. The deliberate erasure of her political genius in favor of a salacious narrative served to delegitimize her rule and justify the actions of those who ultimately overthrew and killed her. Number 8. The queen who dared to rebel and was branded a monster. Isabella of France, queen consort to King Edward II of England in the 14th century, is perhaps one of the most infamously labeled queens in medieval history, known as the She-Wolf of France. Her story is a stark example of how a queen's active participation in politics, particularly when it leads to the deposition of a king, can result in a deliberate and lasting campaign of character assassination. Her motivations, her political acumen, and her initial fight for justice were systematically erased and replaced with a monstrous image. Isabella arrived in England in 1308, a young princess from the powerful French Capetian dynasty married to a king who was increasingly dominated by male favorites. Edward II's favoritism towards figures like Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despencer the Younger alienated the English nobility and caused immense political instability. Isabella, initially a mediating figure, found herself increasingly marginalized and abused by the Despensers, who controlled access to the king and diminished her dower lands. Her children were even threatened. This was not simply a personal grievance. It was a profound threat to her standing as queen and her role in securing the royal succession. When Isabella finally left England for France in 1325, ostensibly on a diplomatic mission, her actions were not driven by simple adultery or vengeful spite, as later narratives would claim. She was seeking redress and support against the Despensers and Edward II, who she believed were ruining the kingdom. While in France, she formed a crucial alliance with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English noble who also harbored grievances. Their relationship became the cornerstone of their plan to invade England. The successful invasion in 1326, the deposition of Edward II and his eventual murder in 1327 sent shockwaves through Europe. Isabella and Mortimer became the de facto rulers of England, governing on behalf of Isabella's young son, Edward III. This unprecedented power wielded by a queen, combined with the scandalous nature of her relationship with Mortimer and the shocking fate of Edward II, provided fertile ground for deliberate vilification. Chroniclers of the period, particularly those writing after Edward III asserted his independence from his mother and Mortimer in 1330, meticulously crafted a narrative designed to strip Isabella of any legitimate political motivation. She was painted as a cruel, manipulative, and sexually depraved woman who seduced Mortimer and engineered her husband's downfall out of personal malice rather than genuine political concern. The moniker She-Wolf of France, popularized by the chronicler Thomas Gray in his Scala Chronica, encapsulates this brutal character. Assassination, it stripped her of her humanity and rational agency, reducing her to an animalistic figure of cunning and ferocity. Her crucial role in organizing the invasion, securing foreign support, and garnering domestic aristocratic backing was diminished. Instead, the focus shifted to her alleged adultery with Mortimer, implying that her political actions were merely a consequence of her illicit desires. This effectively erased the real political grievances she held against Edward II and the Despensers, and the widespread support she initially enjoyed from the English nobility, who were equally desperate to be rid of the hated favorites. Even her role as regent for her son Edward III was presented as a period of misrule and mismanagement, with Mortimer cast as the true power behind the throne, manipulating Isabella. The historical accounts of her later years, spent under the watchful eye of her son, largely ignore her earlier political astuteness, and focus on her perceived ignominy. The deliberate erasure of Isabella's original political motivations and competence served a clear purpose. By presenting her as a monstrous she-wolf, the new regime of Edward III could justify his actions against her and Mortimer, thereby solidifying his own rule. It also reinforced the idea that a queen who dared to step outside the prescribed boundaries of her role, especially in matters of kingship and war, was inherently dangerous and unnatural. Isabella of France remains a powerful figure in history, but her true complexity and the genuine political agency behind her actions are often overshadowed by the enduring, deliberately manufactured image of a vengeful and cruel woman. Number 7. The absent queen whose impact vanished. Berengaria of Navarre, queen consort to the legendary Richard the Lionheart, is often one of the most overlooked figures in English medieval history. Her legacy has been effectively erased, not by direct vilification, but by a pervasive narrative of absence and perceived insignificance. She was a queen of England who barely set foot on English soil, leading to a profound underestimation of her real influence and a fading of her story from popular memory. Born a princess of Navarre, a powerful Pyrenean kingdom, Berengaria married Richard I in Cyprus in 1191, during the Third Crusade. Their union was primarily a political one designed to secure Richard's southern flank during his crusading endeavors and provide him with a legitimate heir. Unlike many medieval queens who made their mark through regencies or political maneuvering within their husband's home kingdoms, Berengaria's importance was largely tied to the crusade and her husband's continental possession. The perception of her as an absent queen is rooted in the fact that she spent almost her entire marriage traveling with Richard through the Holy Land, then in Europe, and never resided in England for an extended period. This geographical distance led to a historical narrative that cast her as inconsequential to English affairs. English chroniclers, focused on domestic events or Richard's dramatic military exploits, have little to say about a queen who's not present at court or involved in regency. Her lack of a direct role in English governance, unlike queens such as Eleanor of Aquitaine who acted as regent, contributed to her historical marginalization. However, Berengaria was far from insignificant. Navarre controlled important mountain passes and trade routes, and its alliance was vital for the Plantagenet continental empire. During the Crusade, she provided invaluable support to Richard, managing his camp, looking after his sister Joan, and participating in diplomatic exchanges. She was in essence a queen on campaign, fulfilling a role that required strength and adaptability. Contemporary accounts from the Crusade, such as those by Ambrose in the Itinerarium, Regis Ricardi, show her presence and influence, though her specific actions are rarely detailed. After Richard's death in 1199, Berengaria faced significant challenges. She was left with little financial support from Richard's successor, King John, who withheld her dower lands. For years, she engaged in persistent and shrewd negotiations with successive popes and French kings, asserting her rights to her dower. This prolonged legal and diplomatic battle, which she eventually won, demonstrates her tenacity and legal acumen. She was a woman who knew her rights and fought tirelessly for them, proving herself an independent and capable figure long after her husband's death. Her later years were spent in France, where she became an abbess at the Cistercian monastery of Les Pots. She devoted herself to piety and charity, continuing to exercise considerable influence within her local community. Yet this entire period of her life, including her significant legal victories and her independent religious patronage, is often neglected in general histories of England. She is reduced to a footnote. Richard the Lionheart's queen, who bore him no children and rarely saw England. The deliberate erasure of Berengaria's impact stems from a narrow focus on queens as primarily defined by their role in ruling their husband's kingdom or producing heirs. Because she did not perform these functions in the traditional English context, her contributions were effectively written out. Her diplomatic utility, her support during the Crusade, and her fierce struggle for her dower rights are sidelined, replaced by a vacuum of information that makes her seem like an unimportant figure. The very fact of her absence from England allowed chroniclers and later historians to largely ignore her, diminishing her agency in contributions and ensuring that her legacy remained a whisper rather than a roar. Number 6. The Crusader queen whose power was undermined. Melisende, Queen of Jerusalem, was a ruler of extraordinary capability and vision in the 12th century, a queen regnant in her own right who presided over the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem during a period of relative peace and prosperity. Despite her undeniable political skill, her legacy was systematically undermined by chroniclers and later historians who found it difficult to reconcile her independent power with prevailing gender expectation. She was praised for her beauty and piety, but her shrewd political acumen and formidable leadership were often attributed to male advisors, or diminished in importance. Melisende inherited the throne in 1131 jointly with her husband Fulk, the 5th of Anjou, and later ruled as sole queen regent for her young son Baldwin III. Her right to rule was based on her direct lineage from Godfrey of Bouillon, the first ruler of Jerusalem. The initial power-sharing arrangement with Fulk was contentious. He attempted to sideline her and claim absolute power, but Melisende, supported by powerful factions within the kingdom, asserted her authority. This early struggle highlights her determination to maintain her sovereign rights. During her reign, which spanned over 2 decades, Melisende was a highly effective ruler. She managed the complex political landscape of the Crusader states, balancing relations with European powers, the Byzantine Empire, and the various Muslim emirates. She personally presided over the high court-appointed officials and issued charters. She was a strong patron of the arts and architecture, sponsoring significant building projects, including the tomb of her mother, Queen Morphia, and overseeing renovation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This patronage was not merely decorative. It was a deliberate assertion of her royal authority and a means to legitimize her rule through pious acts and public works. However, the historical narratives surrounding Melisende frequently attempt to explain away her effectiveness. Chroniclers like William of Tyre, while generally favorable, still grappled with the concept of a woman holding such direct political power. He attributed her initial success in reasserting her authority against Fulk, not to her own strength, but to the counsels of the nobles or her piety. Later in her reign, as her son Baldwin III came of age and sought to claim the throne for himself, William of Tyre's accounts begin to present Melisende as clinging to power, becoming stubborn or irrational. This narrative of a queen unwilling to let go overshadowed her wise governance and her clear transition to ensure a smooth transition of power. The most prominent example of this undermining is the Melisende and Baldwin III crisis of the 1150s. When Baldwin came of age, he demanded full authority. Melisende, recognizing the need for an orderly succession and to avoid civil war, agreed to a division of the kingdom. She retained control of the wealthier southern territories, including Jerusalem itself, and continued to rule these areas effectively. Yet this strategic compromise is often portrayed as a struggle where Baldwin bravely overcame his mother's unreasonable grip on power. The narrative focuses on the son's assertion of masculinity and authority, diminishing Melisende's intelligent and ultimately successful management of the transition. Her independent political actions, such as her decision to launch a military expedition to Ascalon in 1153 without Baldwin's full support, are often viewed through a lens of female impulsiveness rather than strategic foresight. Her diplomatic success with the Byzantine Empire, which involved shrewd negotiations and maintaining a fragile peace, is sometimes presented as an act of personal charm rather than astute statesmanship. Even her role as a queen who maintained peace and stability within the kingdom for many years is understated. As the focus of Crusader histories often gravitates towards military campaigns, Melisendre's legacy was not completely erased, but it was subtly yet consistently diluted. Her image was reshaped from that of a formidable independent ruler into a more palatable figure, a pious, beautiful woman who was perhaps a strong influence but ultimately needed the guidance of men, or who became an obstacle to her son's natural ascent to power. This deliberate reframing served to reinforce gender norms and downplay the true extent of her sovereign authority. Number 5. The first queen regnant vilified for her ambition. Joanna of Leon and Castile, who reigned from 1109 to 1126, holds a unique and often tragic place in medieval history. She was the first queen regnant in Europe. Her rule was marked by relentless civil war, external invasions, and profound personal struggles, all of which were exacerbated by the prevailing societal expectations for a woman in power. The historical record, predominantly written by male chroniclers, deliberately attacked her character, portraying her as immoral, impulsive, and unfit to rule, effectively erasing the complex reality of her political struggles and genuine efforts to maintain her kingdom. Joanna inherited her father, Alfonso, the sixth vast kingdoms of Leon and Castile, a monumental and unprecedented inheritance for a woman in the early 12th century. From the moment she took the throne, she was surrounded by immense pressure. Her father had arranged a marriage to Alfonso I of Aragon, known as the Battler, a union intended to unite the Christian kingdoms of Iberia. However, this marriage proved disastrous. Alfonso of Aragon sought to absorb Leon and Castile into his own domains and rule independently, marginalizing Joanna. Chroniclers of the time, many of whom were clergymen and deeply entrenched in patriarchal views, seized upon the chaotic events of her reign to condemn Joanna. They detailed her scandalous personal life, her tumultuous marriage, her eventual annulment, and her relationship with her lover Pedro González de Lara with lurid enthusiasm. The Historia Compostelana, a chronicle written by the Bishop of Compostela, Diego Galmiras, who is often at odds with Joanna, is particularly harsh. It portrays her as a morally depraved woman driven by lust and incapable of ruling justly. Her relationships were used to discredit her political authority, framing her as someone whose personal failings rendered her unfit for the throne. This focus on her personal life was a deliberate distraction from the real political challenges she faced. Joanna was fighting to maintain the independence of her kingdoms against her aggressive husband, dealing with rebellious nobles who exploited her gender to challenge her authority, and trying to secure the succession for her young son, the future Alfonso VII. Her political maneuvers, her attempts to form alliances, and her military campaigns are often described as erratic or driven by emotion rather than strategic necessity. Her ability to survive nearly 2 decades on the throne amidst constant warfare and betrayal is testament to her resilience and political astuteness, qualities rarely highlighted. The narrative of Joanna as an unruly woman or a sexual deviant served to delegitimize her rule. Because she did not conform to the expected docile female role, her very ambition was seen as a perversion. The chroniclers frequently emphasized internal strife, painting a picture of a kingdom in disarray due to its queen's personal flaws, rather than acknowledging the legitimate power struggles that would have occurred. Regardless of who sat on the throne, her determination to rule independently and to protect her son's inheritance was twisted into selfish ambition, a dangerous characteristic for a woman. Even her efforts to assert her authority, such as her military campaigns against Alfonso of Aragon, are sometimes described in ways that emphasize her unwomanly nature rather than her generalship. She was not a queen who could simply rely on a male regent. She was actively governing, negotiating, and fighting. This direct assertion of power was deeply uncomfortable for the patriarchal society of her time. When Urraca died in 1126, her son, Alfonso VII, took the throne, and his reign is often presented as a period of restoration and stability after his mother's chaotic rule. This further cemented the negative portrayal of Urraca. Her achievements in consolidating her kingdom, even amidst immense internal and external pressure, were overshadowed by the carefully constructed narrative of her moral failings and political instability. The true story of Urraca of Leon and Castile is not that of a flawed woman who stumbled through a reign, but of a pioneering queen who navigated an unprecedented position, facing relentless odds. Number 4. The Empress who ruled and was forever condemned. Irene of Athens, Byzantine Empress, who reigned in the late 8th century, stands as a figure of immense power and controversy. She was the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own right, holding the imperial title as Basileis, Emperor, not Basilissa, Empress. Yet her groundbreaking reign is often overshadowed by one brutal act: the blinding of her own son, Constantine VI. This singular event, while shocking, was deliberately used by her enemies and later chroniclers to paint her as a monstrous figure, effectively erasing her significant political and religious achievements. Irene's rise to power began as Empress Consort to Leo. Upon his death in 780, she became regent for her young son, Constantine VI. From the outset, Irene demonstrated a fierce determination to consolidate power and address the most pressing issue of her era: the iconoclast controversy, a theological and political struggle over the veneration of religious. Irene was a staunch iconophile, believing in the importance of icons, a position that put her at odds with many in the military and the previous imperial policies. Her most significant achievement was orchestrating the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. Through shrewd diplomacy and political maneuvering, she brought about the restoration of icon veneration, a monumental theological and cultural shift that ended decades of religious persecution. This act was deeply significant for the Byzantine Empire, and it required immense political skill to navigate the factions and secure the support of the Pope and the Patriarch. This crucial success, however, is often downplayed in historical narratives in favor of her later misdeeds. The relationship between Irene and her son deteriorated as he grew older and sought to rule independently. Constantine, often portrayed as weak or easily manipulated, chafed under his mother's control. Power struggle culminated in 797, when Irene, fearing being overthrown and imprisoned by her son, ordered him to be blinded. This horrific act secured her position as sole emperor. Chroniclers, both Byzantine and Western, seized upon it as proof of her tyranny and unwomanly ambition. Theophanes, the Confessor, a contemporary Byzantine chronicler, describes the blinding and graphic detail, portraying Irene as a ruthless and unnatural mother. Western chroniclers, particularly those in the Carolingian Empire, used the act to justify their own imperial claims, arguing that a woman on the Byzantine throne, especially one who committed such an atrocity, rendered the imperial seat vacant and legitimate for Charlemagne. This deliberate focus on the blinding effectively overshadowed Irene's political achievements. Her restoration of icons, her diplomatic efforts with the Franks and the Arabs, and her overall management of a complex empire are often relegated to secondary importance. Instead, she is remembered almost solely as the mother who blinded her son, a characterization that denies her the complexity of her reign and the genuine challenges she faced as a female ruler. In a deeply patriarchal society, Within Byzantium, it allowed subsequent emperors to distance themselves from her controversial reign. In the West, it provided a convenient justification for breaking ties with the East and establishing a new Holy Roman Empire. The narrative of her cruelty served to reinforce societal fears about female ambition and power. Queen who dared to rule as an emperor who challenged gender norms and who committed such a heinous act against her own blood became a cautionary tale, her groundbreaking accomplishments deliberately erased. Irene's story is a stark reminder that while the powerful might fall, it is often the narratives constructed by their enemies that prove to be her most enduring prison. Number 3. The Merovingian matriarch branded a tyrant. Brunhilde of Austrasia, a Visigothic princess who became queen of the Frankish kingdoms in the late 6th and early 7th centuries, was one of the most powerful and long-lasting political figures of her age. For nearly 5 decades, she was at the center of Merovingian politics, serving as queen, regent, and de facto ruler across multiple Frankish realms. She married Sigebert, the first king of Austrasia, in 566. Her sister, Galswintha, married Sigebert's brother, Chilperic, the first of Neustria. When Galswintha was murdered, allegedly at the instigation of Chilperic's mistress and later wife, Fredegund, a bitter decades-long civil war erupted between the two kingdoms. Brunhilde became the driving force for vengeance and justice, fighting tirelessly against Chilperic and Fredegund, and later against their son Clothar II. Brunhilde's power stemmed not only from her position as queen, but also from her role as regent for her young sons and grandsons who successively inherited the thrones of Austrasia and Burgundy. She was a politically astute and capable administrator. She established royal control over the fragmented Frankish nobility, reformed the tax system, built roads and churches, and appointed bishops. These were acts of strong, centralized governance in an era of decentralization. Accounts show her traveling across the kingdoms, holding court and making crucial decisions. However, the dominant historical narrative of Brunhilde comes from Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks and the later Fredegar's Chronicle. These sources, particularly Fredegar, are highly biased. Fredegar portrays Brunhilde as a scheming, violent, and utterly ruthless queen, fixated on power and driven by a lust for revenge. He blames her for the constant civil wars, even though her male counterparts were equally engaged in brutal power struggles. Fredegund, her lifelong enemy, is often given a softer, more sympathetic portrayal in comparison, despite her own acts of violence and intrigue. Brunhilde's attempts to consolidate royal authority, which included dealing harshly with rebellious nobles and challenging powerful bishops, were consistently presented as acts of tyranny rather than legitimate governance. Her strength and determination, qualities admired in male rulers, were deemed unwomanly and attributed to malice. Her direct involvement in political and military affairs, unheard of for a woman of her standing, was used to solidify her image as a dangerous, unnatural female ruler. Culmination of this deliberate character assassination came with her downfall. In 613, after decades of fighting, Brunhilde was betrayed by the Austrasian nobility and captured by Clothar II, Fredegund's son. His revenge was horrific. He had her tortured for 3 days, and then tied to the tail of a wild horse and dragged to her death. This gruesome end, meticulously described in the chronicles, cemented her image as a villain who received a just punishment. Chronicles present her death as the triumph of good over evil, the end of a tyrannical reign, rather than the political assassination of a powerful woman who had defied the odds for decades. Her reforms and administrative achievements are rarely highlighted. Instead, the focus remains on her supposed cruelty and the violence she inflicted, or allegedly inflicted. The political complexities of the Merovingian era, the inherent brutality of the times, and the fact that most male rulers were equally, if not more, violent, are all obscured by the singular narrative of Brunhilde's villainy. The deliberate erasure of her contributions as a capable and influential ruler served to justify her brutal end and to provide a lasting cautionary tale about female power in the Frankish kingdoms. Number 2. the empress who defied expectations but not slander. Theodora, empress of the Byzantine Empire, in the 6th century, alongside her husband, Justinian I, was one of the most influential women in Roman history. Her rise from humble origins as an actress and possibly a courtesan to co-ruler of a vast empire was unprecedented. Yet this extraordinary journey and her profound political influence were deliberately twisted and undermined by contemporary and later chroniclers who fixated on her past to discredit her and diminish her rightful place. Theodora's early life, as described by the historian Procopius in his Secret History, was scandalous by the standards of the Byzantine court. She worked in the hippodrome as a performer, a profession that often carried connotations of prostitution. Justinian, then a powerful aristocrat, fell deeply in love with her. Despite societal norms and even laws prohibiting marriage between senators and actresses, Justinian pushed for Theodora to be recognized, eventually changing the law to allow their marriage. When Justinian ascended the throne in 527 CE, Theodora became empress, crowned alongside him as an equal. From this point, Theodora was not merely a consort, she was a true partner in power. Evidence suggests she was Justinian's closest advisor, a political strategist, and a formidable ruler in her own right. She influenced legal reforms, particularly those concerning women's rights, such as laws against forced prostitution, protecting women from sexual assault and granting them more rights in marriage and divorce. She engaged in diplomacy, corresponding with foreign rulers and receiving foreign envoys. She also played a significant role in theological disputes, often supporting the Miaphysites, a Christian faction which put her at odds with many in the Orthodox establishment. However, the historical narrative that has dominated for centuries is largely shaped by Procopius's Secret History. This text, written in secret and only published posthumously, is a vicious polemic against Justinian and Theodora. Procopius, who also wrote the more public Wars and Buildings, where he praised Theodora, paints a horrifying picture of Theodora. He describes her as utterly depraved, manipulative, cruel, and driven by insatiable lust and ambition. He revels in the details of her alleged past as a prostitute, using it to argue that she was fundamentally unfit for rule, and that her influence corrupted Justinian. Procopius's motive for writing the Secret History is debated. Perhaps disillusionment, perhaps revenge, or a genuine belief in their wickedness. Regardless, its existence profoundly impacted Theodora's legacy. It became a powerful tool for those who wished to delegitimize her power. Her intelligence was recast as cunning, her determination as ruthlessness, and her political influence as insidious manipulation. Her legislative achievements were often attributed solely to Justinian, or dismissed as minor acts of a morally corrupt woman. For instance, during the Nika riots in 532 CE, when a massive uprising threatened to depose Justinian, it was Theodora who famously stood firm. While her husband and his advisors, her powerful speech declaring she would rather die an empress than live in exile, rallied the imperial forces and led to the brutal suppression of the revolt. This decisive action saved Justinian's reign, yet later accounts influenced by Procopius might attribute it to her inherent cruelty or stubbornness rather than courageous leadership. The deliberate focus on her perceived vice and her unseemly origins was a patriarchal weapon. It served to discredit any woman who ascended too high, too fast, or who wielded too much power. By emphasizing her sexual past, her critics could argue that she was fundamentally immoral and therefore unworthy of imperial authority, regardless of her actual administrative and political skills. This slander effectively overshadowed her groundbreaking work in law and social reform, her crucial role in the Nika riots, and her significant diplomatic efforts. Theodora's legacy, despite her immense contributions to the Byzantine Empire, was deliberately stained by the narratives crafted by those who could not stomach a woman of her past, holding such unshakable power. Number 1. The imperial regent whose agency was erased. Galla Placidia, a Roman empress of the 5th century, lived during one of the most tumultuous periods of the Western Roman Empire's decline. She was the daughter of an emperor, sister to an emperor, wife to a Gothic king, and then to another Roman emperor, and finally mother and regent to Emperor Valentinian III. Her life was a saga of kidnapping, forced marriage, political maneuvering, and fierce determination to preserve the Roman legacy. Yet despite her incredible political acumen and her central role in the dying days of the empire, her agency and influence were frequently downplayed, dismissed, or attributed to male figures, effectively erasing her true impact. Born around 392 CE, Galla Placia was a princess of the imperial Theodosian dynasty. In 410 CE, she was captured by the Visigoths during their sack of Rome. This began a period of captivity that saw her travel with the Goths, eventually marrying their king Etulf in 414 CE. This marriage, though initially forced, seemed to develop into a genuine partnership. Etulf, influenced by Placia, even shifted his ambition from destroying Rome to restoring it under Gothic leadership. This influence, a testament to Placia's diplomatic skills, is often overlooked. Contemporary historians, like Olympiodorus of Thebes, hint at her influence, but many narratives reduce her to a captive rather than an influential consort. After Etulf's death and her return to Roman control, Placia was forced into another political marriage, this time to the Roman general Constantius III. She hated him, but the union solidified her position within the imperial court. When Constantius briefly became co-emperor and then died, and her brother Honorius died without an heir, Placidia became the crucial figure in establishing her young son Valentinian III as the next Western Roman emperor. It was during her regency for Valentinian III, 425 to 437 CE, that Galla Placia wielded significant power. She governed the Western Empire from Ravenna, managing political factions, dealing with military threats from various barbarian groups, and maintaining relations with the Eastern Roman Empire. She issued laws, appointed officials, and oversaw military campaigns. For instance, she played a key role in the appointment of Bonifacius, a powerful Roman general in Africa, a move that would have significant consequences for the empire's control of its North African provinces. Her diplomatic engagement with the Huns and the Vandals was constant and complex. However, historical narratives frequently attribute the successes of her regency to her male generals and advisors such as Aetius, the last of the Romans. While these men were undeniably powerful, Placidia was the ultimate decision-maker, navigating their rivalries and utilizing their talents. Chroniclers like Prosper of Aquitaine, while recording events of her regency, rarely highlight her direct initiatives. Her shrewdness is often implicit rather than explicitly stated as her own agency. She is often presented as a pious empress or a mother concerned for her son rather than a master politician. The very concept of a female regent during this period was challenging for many. Her role was often framed as temporary, a placeholder, until her son came of age, even though her influence continued well beyond his formal majority. The prevailing narrative of the Roman Empire's decline also contributed to the erasure of her effective governance. Instead of being lauded for her resilience and ability to hold the crumbling empire together for so long, she is often seen as presiding over its inevitable demise. Her efforts, ultimately futile, her efforts to maintain stability and restore a semblance of Roman authority in a world collapsing around her, are systematically downplayed. The deliberate erasure of Galla Placidia's full political agency stems from a reluctance to acknowledge a woman as the central controlling figure in such a critical period. Her power was often explained away as a necessity of the times, rather than a testament to her unique capabilities. By presenting her as primarily influenced by men, or as a passive figure in the grand drama of the empire's fall, her true status as a remarkably effective and cunning leader in a chaotic world was subtly, but effectively, diminished.